Welcome to Resolve IBS and IBD Naturally. I'm Courtney Cowie, a nutrition therapy and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. If you are struggling with the symptoms of IBS or IBD and want to get to the root cause of your symptoms so you can take back your health through a whole person approach, this podcast is for you. Just a disclaimer that the information I'm presenting in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. You should always consult a qualified practitioner before making any changes to your health or medical regimen. That being said, let's get on with the show. So the topic for today is talking about caffeine and sugar, and I find that these two things tend to be huge vices for the clients I work with for various reasons. And if you struggle with completely getting off one or the other of these, you will know exactly what I mean. So I want to talk a little bit about this topic and my experience with working with clients around these things, and actually maybe give you a bit of insight on what I think drives these addictions, because I really feel at the root of it, there's very little to do with the foods themselves. Definitely that can be a component, and I'll touch on that as I go through today's topic, but I want to talk a little bit about other aspects of the body, mind, the connection there that does play a role in health, but specifically addictions, whether caffeine, sugar, or even other things. So when we're talking about just addictive tendencies, we really are talking about the nervous system on some level. And this is kind of an underrated aspect of health, even in functional medicine. It doesn't get a lot of play from the functional medicine community. I think this will become more and more important with time. But one thing to really understand is that our organs, the gut, for example, they are very much important physiological components that dictate how our body functions on that physiological level. But the nervous system, although yes, it does have nerve tissue, the brain, spinal cord, etc., there's this energetic component to it. There's this mind sort of emotional spirit component to it. And this is sort of the aspect we're tapping into when we're looking at addictions and struggles around things like caffeine, sugar, and what drives those compulsions to utilize those substances. I find that specifically with my autoimmune clients or my gut condition clients, whether they're struggling with IBS, acid reflux, or something else, that there are hand in hand with these things often a lot of hidden maladaptive thoughts or coping mechanisms that these individuals have developed to deal with their undesirable feelings that in fact are driving the addictions at a deeper level. And I say this because if you look at just all of the factors that tend to correlate with people that end up with an autoimmune diagnosis or a diagnosis like IBS, there's quite substantially information pointing to the fact that there's trauma, there is stress, there's a lot of mental, emotional, spiritual disruptions that they've had all the way back since birth or childhood that have dysregulated both their nervous system and their immune system, that are driving a lot of the symptoms they're having. This isn't by itself, of course, enough to explain it, but there's a huge component of these conditions that goes back to the mind spirit piece, right? And so because health and well-being really derive from both physical and mental well-being, it's really, really common to see both components, meaning both a physiological as well as a mental, emotional component in any chronic health picture, but especially autoimmune disease and something like IBS. So because of this, I feel like the secret to quitting caffeine and sugar really has more to do with identifying the unmet feelings and needs of each specific individual struggling with this that keeps them addicted to these substances in the first place. This also comes up quite a bit with the clients I've worked with who are struggling with weight loss as well, and a very common theme in the weight loss picture, because a lot of times there are eating habits and, again, compulsions and addictions that are driving maladaptive eating behaviors that are lending to people eating unhealthy foods or maybe overeating certain foods that contribute to their weight loss struggle. And, whether we consciously realize that or not, often what we're reaching for just to cope with these feelings we have deep down if we're not really in tune with them, is some sort of substance or tool to numb from them, to cope with them. And one of those easy reaches is food or drugs. And I would consider caffeine a drug in this case. Sugar could actually be a drug as well if you look at what it does to the brain. So we really need to evaluate those deeper down feelings, potentially stored trauma and other issues that go quite a ways back. But we also need to take a look at a person's current level of stress, because again, even if we have a scenario where an individual is ready and willing to deal with trauma from the past, or just different unresolved events they've got from the past, if they're also in present day living a very stressful life, the burden and the overwhelm of that stress is going to make it very difficult to give up addictions as well. So I feel like stress in general is just a direct result. How much we feel is a direct result of how congruent we are living in according to what we really want deep down. Or another way of saying this is what our soul really wants, which comes from really understanding ourselves on a deep level and making conscious choices to align our life according to sort of the direction that we really want to go. So, to give examples more concretely around this, for example, do you find true satisfaction and meaning in the work that you do, for example? Do you feel truly like you're on the right path with your friendships? Do you feel like you have people in your network that truly know who you are and support you, through thick and thin? Do you feel like you're in alignment and spending your time doing things that you really want to be doing deep down? These are some of the deeper questions that often a person can ponder to really get clarity on how congruent they are in terms of living their life. And that will give a lot of insight into stress, because stress often comes from taking on responsibilities we don't want to, taking on too much, getting ourselves into situations that we struggle inherently to deal with because they're just not in our skill set, or they're not in our wheelhouse. I mean, there's other obviously forms of stress as well, but these are just some examples. So, really ultimately this entire topic of stress, the mind, the body, the spirit, gets us back to kind of how we think. So mindset, psychology, thought processes, and how we process life on the mental, emotional level. So, let's talk a little bit about both caffeine as well as sugar, and just what they do to the body physiologically, and how these effects can be really difficult to get off of or get away from if you're trying to get these substances out of your life. So caffeine is a strong push to the nervous system, and it disrupts what's called the HPA axis, and that stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is a triad of glands that generally govern sex hormones, whether that's progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, as well as the thyroid hormones, as well as even your stress hormones like cortisol, which is produced in the adrenal gland. And there's kind of this synchronicity of hormones in an optimal circadian rhythm for these things that should be happening throughout the body. And a lot of different factors can disrupt that. Of course, this is a big part of the work I do with my clients in the very beginning when I'm investigating why they have a lot of these imbalances. And one thing we always look for, of course, is hidden infections in the gut or other physiological things that might be literally stressing their bodies out on a deeper level that we can work on getting rid of or eradicating. But the other factors that are oftentimes very obvious but not so easy to deal with at times are the psychological, the lifestyle, the emotional factors. And this would boil down more to your job, your family, your friendships, your support system, other factors like that. Because again, if there isn't synchronicity in how you perceive these areas of your life, it's going to impact the function of the body, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. So lots of different things can disrupt that HPA axis. Now, if you bring caffeine into this particular equation, it can be a stronger push to this axis, simply because caffeine will actually push the adrenal glands to produce more cortisol. And cortisol, as you might know, is stimulatory. And part of the reason why it is so addictive is that people tend to struggle with what's called adrenal fatigue, or we could say HPA axis dysregulation, where as this goes on over time, their cortisol levels start to drop off because the adrenal glands can't keep outputting tons of cortisol. And then they find that caffeine is sort of an easy stopgap solution that they can use to help their body, again, push more cortisol out so that they can get a burst of energy, they can focus at work, they can, get their game on with their kids, whatever it is. It's a very easy band-aid solution for people that can be very difficult to get away from, because in a sense it does work for that short period of time, and it can sometimes continue to work quite well for a while before a person might stop responding to the effects of caffeine. And again, that's just very dependent on the individual and how quickly they progress down that axis of HPA axis dysregulation. So with caffeine, the interesting thing to know though is that it's a little bit of a trade-off. So if you think of the body's energy pot as being kind of like a bank account, when you're using caffeine, it's going to be causing your body to make a withdrawal. And so ultimately, the things that are really going to replenish that bank account are going to be things like solid sleep, really good nutrition, rest, a good balance between work and play, which a lot of people really aren't getting. And then for the push that caffeine puts on the system, it's like a big withdrawal that then requires a lot of replenishment to actually make up. And so what ends up happening is that when a person uses caffeine, they're getting a strong withdrawal that might last them for a few hours, maybe half a day at best, but then eventually they're going to feel that crash from that, and they'll ultimately end up more fatigued and more dysregulated because they had this strong bank account withdrawal, so to speak, without really having a foundational input back into that account. So hopefully that analogy kind of makes sense. But over time, we're very much short-term reward beings, where we tend to focus on what we can get immediate reward from without thinking about the long-term consequences of things. So I think this is the other issue people fall into with caffeine addiction, is that they just need the energy now, and this is it's always worked for them, and they're just going to do it, not realizing that if they were to step back and look back over the last few years, they would see that overall energy levels likely have dropped off with time. They haven't actually gotten better, they've gotten worse. Do you find yourself getting up super early on work days in order to get done with multiple runs to the bathroom, or waiting and waiting to finally have a bowel movement? Has living your life around unpredictable bowel movements and other chronic gut symptoms left you feeling trapped, stressed, and dealing with anxiety? There are often hidden factors and stressors driving these symptoms, factors that your doctor isn't trained to help you find. Getting to the bottom of these factors, along with the right nutritional approach, is the key to resolving your symptoms. Interested in learning more? Click the link to grab my free e-guide. So, one thing I want to talk about with regards to the HPA axis and adrenal gland function is that this plays very strongly into gut function, and a lot of people don't know that. And this is partly why I evaluate both hormones and that axis function as well as the gut in the very beginning with clients, because I want to see what that relationship is. I want to see what's going on both ends of that spectrum. And so when the HPA axis becomes dysregulated, the adrenal glands start to get what used to be called fatigued. They get kind of stressed and they're not producing optimal amounts of cortisol anymore. That will eventually impact the gut. Too much cortisol can create a lot of breakdown and inflammation in the gut. Too little cortisol, obviously, is a big problem too. And because a lot of the immune system, up to about 75-80% of it, lives within the lining of the small intestine, there's a big relationship between gut function and immune function. And so as you can imagine, when adrenal glands get taxed, the HPA axis gets dysregulated, the gut function starts to get imbalanced. Eventually the immune system starts to actually go out of whack too. And with the right factors in place, this can start to lead to uncontrolled inflammation and even start to set the stage for autoimmune disease. So there's a lot of interrelationships in all of these different systems of the body that are really important. And again, just going back to the caffeine piece, when I'm working with someone who's very dysregulated, ultimately we need to sit down and have a conversation about caffeine usage if they are relying on this habitually to get them through the day, because it's going to be very difficult to get the gut in order and to get the immune system in order if they're using a substance that's causing their basically pushing their adrenal glands to keep mounting a stress response. So hopefully that makes sense. The other thing about caffeine I wanted to speak to too is that it can be very problematic just to the gut itself because of the effects it has on motility. And typically what it will do is speed up motility. So if you're a person who struggles with IBS-D, chronic loose stool, IBD, you might already intuitively have known or figured out that if you eat or drink caffeine or even eat caffeinated foods, potentially like chocolate, you notice you have a pretty significant reaction within a short window of time because the caffeine is just pushing already dysregulated gut further along. So that can be super uncomfortable. And of course, a lot of people have figured this out and just choose to get off of it because they don't want that added exacerbation. And then depending on the source of caffeine, let's say, for example, it's coffee, lots of forms of coffee, depending on how you drink it, the quality of the bean, etc., can be very, very acidic, and that can be really difficult on the gut as well. It can definitely cause inflammation. It can cause stomach acid levels over time. It can just be hard on the gut. And again, this kind of goes back to just your individual potentials and genetics and how different foods work or don't work with your system. The reality is sometimes people just aren't wired to be habitual coffee drinkers. They might be able to handle a little bit from time to time, or maybe really not much at all. And then others, of course, can drink it daily and drink it in copious amounts, and they're totally okay. So this is sort of a little bit of the nuance in this work, but I did want to kind of speak to the fact that caffeine and coffee specifically can have detrimental impacts on the gut itself. Let's talk a bit about sugar. So sugar, the main problem with it, I mean, there's lots of problems, of course, just in and of itself, it's an inflammatory substance, probably one of the most inflammatory ingredients you can consume food-wise, right? And again, depending on the form, it's going to be better or worse. I would personally say that sweetener wise, I'm a bigger fan of honey, maple syrup, blackstrap molasses because they contain minerals and more nutrients than just straight up white table sugar will, right? I just feel like white table sugar, if you're equipped with a good amount of nutritional knowledge, you should probably just give that up completely if you can. However, just any type of sugar, essentially, whether it's honey or white table sugar, will break down into glucose. And too much glucose in the body will tend to drive insulin resistance, metabolic dysregulation, and again, consumed excessively over time will start to push a person on that spectrum more and more towards type 2 diabetes. Again, just depending on their genetics and other factors. So there's obviously that one concern with it. But from the perspective I see actually more often, because I work with a lot of gut health clients, I would say, sugar can be really problematic dietarily, even natural sweeteners like honey and maple syrup, because it breaks down into glucose. And that will tend to feed bacterial overgrowth. It will definitely feed yeast and fungal overgrowth in the digestive system. It's kind of the perfect food for bacteria, pathogens of all sorts. I mean, parasites love sugar as well. And because I run a comprehensive stool test on all of my clients that looks at all of those imbalances, and I've never had a test that hasn't come back with something, whether it's a bacterial, yeast, parasitic thing. We often, again, have to look at just sugar consumption and talk about means of lowering that, and in some cases completely getting it out in order to effectively deal with certain overgrowths and I would say hidden infections in the gut. And this can be obviously very, very difficult because so many of us have grown up with sugar in our diet. It's a sneaky ingredient, even in things like ketchup, even organic ketchups. You really almost have to be really cautious and diligent around reading labels at the grocery store. But point being, sugar is something we need to really mind when we're dealing with eradicating and rebalancing the gut, eradicating those infections. So even if a person doesn't have gut imbalances, it's one of those things that if it's consumed in excess over time is going to set up an environment where there's more potential for those infections to show up, just because microbes will tend to gravitate and take up residence in a gut that's got a good food source for them to thrive. Really, what I feel like is key with sugar and caffeine is not so much just trying to give them up cold turkey, not so much looking at, substitutes. I'm not a big fan of like xylitol and sugar alcohols as a substitute for sugar. I think truly, if people can get them out, but they aren't thinking about and addressing those deeper down emotional issues, trauma, stress in their lives, inevitably there's going to be a window of time where they're going to fall off the wagon, and guaranteed caffeine and sugar are going to come back into the picture. It's kind of like, someone who's maybe had trouble with alcoholism and then, stays dry for a long time and then all of a sudden has an alcoholic drink again under the right conditions. It's not the best analogy, but sort of what I'm explaining here is that this goes beyond food from my perspective. And of course, we do want strategies to minimize and eventually, in some cases, maybe eradicate or eliminate these things from the diet. However, doing it just through nutritional and food means alone is not going to be enough. There needs to be a component where the client is willing to do some deeper work to rebalance their nervous system, to work with better emotional regulation, potentially to resolve some past traumas or other stressors they've got going on in their life. Did you find this episode informative and helpful? I'd love to have you leave me a 5-star rating. Do you have questions about holistic approaches to optimizing gut health that you'd like to ask? Please leave your question or comment below, and I will be sure to address it personally or cover it in a future episode. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode. See you next time.